I've talked about the term dream matches before and how I feel like it's overused. It feels like whenever they have a big match they want to hype up, they call it a dream match, whether it actually fits the parameters of being a dream match at all. I know I sound like I'm being a spoil sport and just ruining everybody's good time, but to me, a dream match is something a little bit more epic than something that's guaranteed to get between 4 and 5 stars from Meltzer, or something involving guys that are on the roster at the same time and are bound to cross paths at some point. To me, dream matches should be like the Battle of Legends that you probably wouldn't think would have ever taken place, but potentially could have. Dream matches to me are a little bit more, I guess, out of the scope of reality than a standard match that especially in today's day and age where you see matches given away all the time on free TV. So those pairings aren't quite as special anymore. But for this video, I wanted to take a look at the grandest stage of them all, WrestleMania, and some of the great matches that could have potentially taken place at WrestleMania. And what I mean by that is what I'm going to be doing for this top 10 list is picking out those dream matches that could have happened at WrestleMania. There were opportunities to do it at WrestleMania, but for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. Now, this doesn't mean that these guys that are, or these specific pairings never faced off. And in some cases, they may have faced each other a few too many times, but for whatever reason, it just didn't happen at WrestleMania, and there would have been perfect opportunities to do so. So I thought it'd be fun to go ahead and take a look at some of those potential WrestleMania dream matches that we could have gotten, but didn't. Now, a couple of my rules for my selections. I'm going to pick pairings that absolutely could have happened, which would have meant that both guys were active members of the roster at specific points in time for a specific WrestleMania, if that makes any sense at all. Or at the very least, I'll bend the rule a little bit and say there was a time where somebody was a free agent and there were negotiations and it didn't happen. That's about as far as I'm willing to go. But I want to keep this as far as like within the realm of possibility as possible. And that means both guys on the roster at the same time as active participants. And they would have had to be, and those would have had to have been met in time for a WrestleMania, at least one WrestleMania. I guess I'll go ahead and list my honorable mentions now, the ones that didn't make the list. One that I was toying around with putting on the list was The Undertaker versus Andre the Giant, which I had listed as potentially taking place at WrestleMania 7, where Undertaker made his WrestleMania debut, and Andre the Giant made a special appearance helping out the Big Boss Man against Mr. Perfect and Bobby Heenan, and the rest of the Heenan family. And I thought, man, wouldn't it have been cool if they did Undertaker versus Andre at WrestleMania 7? Unfortunately, Andre was retired by that point, so I'm kind of like fudging it a little bit, and I'm like, that one wouldn't quite fit. It's still a dream match. I think Undertaker and Andre is one of those, like, man, how cool. Like, the stare down alone, the image of those two in the ring together would have been cool on its own. But I don't think that there was a reasonable point in time where it could have happened at WrestleMania. And we just missed it, too, because Andre's last WrestleMania match was in 1990. Undertaker debuted in 1990 later that year and made his WrestleMania debut just a few months later at WrestleMania 7. It's like, man, we just missed it. Just missed it. But another one that I was toying around with was Shawn Michaels versus Eddie Guerrero. This would have taken place at WrestleMania 22. The rumor is that it was supposed to happen at WrestleMania 22. That was the original plan, instead of having Shawn face off against Vince McMahon. But unfortunately, Eddie's untimely passing kind of prevented that from taking place. I tried to think of other points where Eddie versus Shawn could have happened, but 19, we got the match with Shawn and Jericho, and that was a great one, so I wouldn't want to lose that. 20, we had that awesome main event, although I guess if I were going to stretch it, you could have taken Shawn out of the triple threat, have Benoit and Triple H one-on-one, and then do Eddie versus Shawn. That could have worked, but still, you don't want to lose that great main event, so I kind of was like, I don't really want to lose that. And then at 21, he faced off against Angle, which was a great match. I was like, I don't really want to lose that either. So, unfortunately, that great match between Shawn and Eddie never happened. And the time it could and should have happened, unfortunately, was stopped because of Eddie's passing. So I kept that on the honorable mentions list, not on the actual top 10 list. But that was one that was very close to making it. Another one that was very close was The Outsiders versus D-Generation X, which I had as potentially taking place at WrestleMania 18. Unfortunately, WrestleMania 18 took place just a few months before Shawn showed up again. So to me, it's like, yeah, I mean, NWO, Hall and Nash versus Triple H and Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania would have been a really cool match. for history's sake, if nothing else, especially coming right off the Monday Night Wars. It's one of those, like, dream match scenarios that we didn't quite get out of the Invasion angle. It would have been a cool one to have. Unfortunately, Shawn wasn't there yet, so I felt like I'd be stretching it. And I guess you could have put X-Pac on the DX side, but that would have been like, Like, X-Pac, I mean, no knock on Sean Waltman, but he's no Shawn Michaels. It's not the same thing. So that was when I decided to move to the honorable mentions list. Another one, going back to WrestleMania 22, was Undertaker versus Kurt Angle, who wrestled each other quite a bit. They had actually had a classic match at No Way Out the month before WrestleMania in 2006. My personal favorite match that they had was that SmackDown match in 2003. Even though they didn't have a finish, I thought the match itself was amazing, and I was like, wow, that was... Angle and Taker just really, really shine there. They also had a couple matches in 2002. They had a WWF title match at Survivor Series 2000. Their first pay-per-view meeting was in Fully Loaded 2000, where Undertaker pretty much chewed up Angle and spat him out. But it was, they could have done Angle and Taker at WrestleMania for the title. The real monkey wrench that got thrown into that is that they were going to put the belt on Ray, and Angle was just kind of the guy holding the belt to give it to Ray. I probably would have considered putting the belt on Orton and doing Angle and Taker non-title, and then just do Ray and Orton for the title. That's probably how I would have done it, because instead, like, Angle got put in the title match, and Taker unfortunately got stuck working with Mark Henry in a not a bad match, but one that was just kind of like, it was just kind of... It felt like Mark Henry was just another number in the streak, and it didn't have any kind of speciality to it. I think I left it off the list, though, and kept it in the honorable mentions because I did see Undertaker and Angle wrestle each other so many times that I'm not really starved for it. And again, that's not necessarily going to disqualify a selection from the list, but it's just hard for me to think of that one as kind of a dream match just because I saw it so many times. Yeah, so those are some of my honorable mentions. Now let's get to the actual list itself. And again, just keep the rules in mind where it's like, all right, these are guys that had to have been on the roster at the same time. So there has to be some kind of likelihood that they could have crossed paths and had a grand match at the grandest stage of them all. So without further ado, let's jump into the list. At the number 10 slot, I have a match that doesn't get brought up all that much, but it's one that I always kind of wanted to see as a fully fledged program. Randy Macho Man Savage versus Rowdy Roddy Piper, two of the most bombastic and over-the-top personalities from that era of the WWE. And it's kind of amazing to me that they never had a fully fledged program against each other, much less a WrestleMania match. And the one time it would have fit at WrestleMania, where it would have been a perfect opportunity to do it, would have been WrestleMania 6. Savage was in the program with Dusty Rhodes, which led to the mixed tag match with Sherry and Sapphire thrown into the mix. And that match was fun, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't one of Savage's most epic WrestleMania encounters. And Rowdy Roddy Piper, most infamously, came down to the ring half-painted black for his battle with Bad News Brown, which was an otherwise very forgettable match and kind of a dull feud. And where I got the idea to do Savage and Piper came from watching Royal Rumble 1990, which ironically was a continuation of the Dusty feud. And also the starting point for the Roddy and Bad News Brown feud. But there's a brief moment in that match where it's DiBiase, Jake Roberts, Randy Savage, and Roddy Piper, four of the greatest personalities of the WWF during that era. And I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool if Savage and Piper had a program? That'd be awesome. Unfortunately, we didn't get it, and it's a shame, too, because I think that somebody who's as closely tied to WrestleMania as Roddy Piper is, given he was in the main event of the first one, and the constant WrestleMania show stealer that was Randy Savage in the first few Manias, I think putting the two together would have created something a lot more special for WrestleMania 6 than what they ultimately ended up doing with them. Next up is one that I've thought about personally for years. Macho Man Randy Savage versus the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels. I have this one taking place at WrestleMania 9, mainly because, well, it would have been the perfect place to have this match. Randy was unfortunately being slowly phased out of in-ring competition and actually spent WrestleMania 9 as a commentator, not taking place in any match at all. And Shawn Michaels was working with the undefeated Tatanka for the Intercontinental Championship. The IC title match itself was fine, but not the WrestleMania Classic and not something that often gets talked about in Shawn Michaels' long and illustrious career. And since then, Shawn would go on to become Mr. WrestleMania and would have what many consider to be the greatest body of work in the history of any WrestleMania performer. How great would it have been, and how much better could Shawn Michaels' WrestleMania resume have been had he duked it out with Macho Man Randy Savage, the guy that originally set the standard for the WrestleMania Classic with his bouts with Ricky Steamboat and Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior and Ric Flair. Savage was originally that guy who was having the best match at WrestleMania. So this could have been a very interesting passing of the torch with Randy putting over Shawn Michaels, the guy who, starting with WrestleMania 10, would ultimately become the guy that would go on to have the best matches at each WrestleMania he performed in. So we did get this match. They worked various house shows and live events in 1992, but to get it on a grand stage like WrestleMania would have been great. Next up is yet another Randy Savage match, and another match that could have taken place at WrestleMania 9. But this is another one that I've put a lot of thought into and often wondered over the years, man, what would have happened if we actually got that one? This was the first year where the Royal Rumble winner would get the title shot in WrestleMania's main event. Randy Savage was the runner-up in the 1993 Royal Rumble, so I've often wondered, what if Randy Savage won that Royal Rumble? We would have gotten Bret Hart versus Randy Savage in the grand stage in the main event at WrestleMania. And I'll tell you one thing, not only would this have been a great match, almost assuredly, I can also tell you that we definitely would not have gotten that BS ending with Hulk Hogan stealing the title at the end and Yokozuna getting screwed and all that stuff. But, in any case, we would have gotten this great dream match in the main event of WrestleMania, and I think it would have been quite the classic if we'd been allowed to get it. Now, Savage and Bret had matches in the past. They actually had a match on Saturday Night's Main Event years prior, which I said was the greatest match in Saturday Night's Main Event history. So could you imagine with a Bret Hart that was a little bit more polished at this point, on a grand stage like WrestleMania, I think they could have torn the house down and given us one hell of a main event had they been allowed to do so. When you think of the Monday Night Wars period, you instantly think of the iconic superstars that inhabited that time period for professional wrestling. The stars of both the WWF and WCW, and immediately when I think of those two companies, I think of Stone Cold Steve Austin, the personification of WWF attitude, and Goldberg, the master of the streak and the guy that represented WCW and stood up against the NWO. In 1998, they were really like the two biggest stars of their respective companies. So it's easy to kind of want to see what would happen if they were put up against each other in a match. There weren't many opportunities to have that match. Goldberg was one of the holdouts from WCW that didn't go over to the WWF right away once WCW was sold to them. And Stone Cold Steve Austin's wrestling career was slowly winding down. He had the walkout in 2002. Came back in 2003 in time for WrestleMania, and Goldberg had actually signed with the WWE at that point in early 2003, and his eventual debut was hyped up. He was actually the post-Mania surprise the next night on Raw. So my thinking is, man, wouldn't it have been cool if they had hyped up Goldberg's debut for WrestleMania, and they'd put him up against Stone Cold Steve Austin? They could have said, like, Austin making his grand return to WWF after walking out, and then you have Goldberg coming in to be his first challenger. So it would have been like, ooh, what's going to happen? You've got one guy returning and one guy making his debut. Now, WrestleMania 19 ended up being Austin's final match, so logic would dictate that Goldberg probably would have gone over here. But in any case, I think WrestleMania 19 is a show that had plenty of great matches, and the match that Austin had with Rock was certainly not a downer by any means. But it's fun to think about what it would have been like if we had actually gotten the two most iconic bald wrestlers in the history of the business square up and tangle on WrestleMania 19. Next up is one that often gets talked about a lot, and one that you all probably expected to be much higher on the list. Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8. The fact that WWF opted not to have this match is often considered a major Mania blunder. Many fans have, with the value of hindsight, have gone back and said that this match absolutely should have taken place at WrestleMania 8. There have been some reports that Vince wasn't happy with how the matches were drawing at live events. There have been talks that who was going to go over. Hogan was taking time off afterwards, but they wanted Flair to drop the belt. So there were a lot of creative things that kind of got in the way as well. So, and me personally, and one of the reasons that this match is somewhat low on the list, is that I saw this match 9,000 times in WCW, and it was increasingly bad each time it happened. Definitely an example of the law of diminishing returns. I did like their Bash to the Beach 1994 match, and I really enjoyed their first match on the Clash of Champions as well. But overall, I was not a huge fan of Hogan and Flair's bouts together. I don't think they had that great a chemistry. But for the sake of history and the sake of having the greatest icon of the WWF in the 80s and the greatest icon of the NWA in the 80s clashing at WrestleMania, I think would have been one for the history books, if nothing else. Now, I don't regret at all that we got the Flair Savage match, because I think that match is excellent and I love it. But, Hogan Flair, that is just one of those attractive, should have been a WrestleMania matches but didn't happen type of thing that I can understand why a lot of fans would look back at this as a mistake that they didn't do this match. Me personally, I wasn't the biggest fan of their matches, but again, for the sake of history, I feel like this match belongs on a list like this. Next up is a match that I hear get talked about often, but never really happened in any kind of significant way, and that is The Rock versus Shawn Michaels, the Great One versus the Heartbreak Kid. Now, there are more personal reasons for why this match didn't take place. I've heard Rock say that he never wanted to work with Shawn Michaels because of disrespect that happened when Shawn Michaels was at his absolute worst in the 90s. But it is kind of amazing that there were times where they absolutely could have done this match and it just didn't happen. The 2 years they probably could have done it would have been WrestleMania 19 and WrestleMania 20. Now, unfortunately, the problem with having Shawn Michaels on a list like this at all is that if I switch out a dream match, you're losing another WrestleMania great match, like the triple threat at 20 or the match with Jericho at 19. I talked about it with the Shawn Michaels dream match with Eddie. God, when would you do Shawn and Eddie before WrestleMania 22? Because you would lose so many great matches. But I think The Rock and Shawn Michaels are such big stars and so important to the history of the WWF that this match could have and probably should have happened at WrestleMania at some point. Like I said, the best two examples to have done it would have been WrestleMania 19 and WrestleMania 20. So I guess if the Goldberg-Austin match happened at WrestleMania 19, it could potentially have been Rock and Shawn Michaels at 19 as well. And I don't know where that leaves Jericho, unfortunately. But it would have been cool to see two charismatic figures like The Rock and like Shawn Michaels have a program against each other and see what they could do in a match together. It would have been very interesting, to say the least. We move right along to another match that could have taken place at WrestleMania 20. The Undertaker versus Goldberg. Now, this would have been a very interesting one to have because WrestleMania 20 marked the return of the Dead Man Undertaker, moving on from the American Badass back to the gimmick that made him famous in the first place. And Goldberg was on the way out, but as we recall, that match he had with Brock Lesnar in what would be his final WWE match for 13 years was quite the stinker, and probably should have been a great match, would have been a dream match on most any other nights, but the fact that both men were leaving kind of put a damper on the whole thing. So instead of doing the match with Lesnar, what if we had actually gotten the battle of the two men with the most famous streaks in wrestling history? The Undertaker, undefeated at WrestleMania, versus the man that tore through WCW and won over 100 matches without being beaten. Defeating Hulk Hogan to become the World Heavyweight Champion, something that The Undertaker had actually done in his past as well. It would have been very interesting if these two crossed paths. And I remember when they met up in that one Royal Rumble, it was like, man, that looked cool for a couple of seconds, and it makes you wonder if we got them when they were younger, if we got them in 2004 with Goldberg on the way out, could they have had a really cool match? And it would have been, at the very least, because Taker would have gone over, obviously, but it would have been a very interesting little historical footnote in Undertaker's streak that he defeated Goldberg, the man with the other most famous streak in wrestling history. So, again, it's a fun one to think about. At number 3, I have a match that many would consider to be the definitive dream match. The Undertaker versus the Icon Sting. The most mysterious and dark figure in WWE history going up against the savior of WCW, the one who donned the Crow gimmick and joined the dark side in order to defeat the NWO. The idea of crossing Undertaker and Sting together is one that I'd always thought about going all the way back to 1997, maybe even before then when Sting was in the Surfer gimmick. It's a match I always wanted to see, and I kind of always held out hope that it would happen. Unfortunately, as both men got older, and even when Sting eventually showed up in the WWE, the hope that match was going to happen or even live up to its expectations had pretty much dwindled. But there were quite a few opportunities to do it. I remember reading that when Sting was a free agent heading into WrestleMania 19, that there were talks that Sting was going to join and they were going to do Undertaker versus Sting at Mania 19. It's almost definite that they had it on the books for WrestleMania 27, as there were big talks that Sting was in talks with WWE at that time, and at the last minute it fell through and they ended up doing Triple H and Undertaker instead. And obviously the only WrestleMania where both of them were on the card together was Sting's WWE debut at WrestleMania 31 in that ridiculous match with Triple H where Sting put him over and killed everybody's buzz. So if they were just going to have Sting lose his first match anyway, probably should have just done the match with Undertaker just to, give us the match that we wanted. But man, it looks like we're never going to get this match. And I think for a lot of fans, it's going to be one of the great tragedies in wrestling history that it never happened in any kind of significant way. We never got Sting versus The Undertaker. But when I think on some of the WrestleMania matches that could have been, probably should have been, it is kind of a shame that we didn't get that match, because I think it would have been, at the very least, the build-up would have been super cool. They would have used a lot of special effects, obviously, and great promo packages, and the stare down alone would have just rocked my socks off, without a doubt. Here's a weird one. What would have happened if Hulk Hogan, the WWF icon of the 1980s, went up against the guy that really made the New York territory in the decades before Hogan in the 60s and 70s, Bruno Sammartino? And it's hard to even imagine that match taking place because they almost feel like they're from completely different time periods. Like, if you look at footage from when Bruno was wrestling and look at footage from when Hogan was at his peak, it's kind of like they almost look like they're from a different century almost. Not that I'm putting either one of them down. It's just they feel like they come from completely different eras. But there actually exists a WrestleMania where both of them wrestled on the same card. Bruno Sammartino was a participant in the WWF NFL Battle Royal of WrestleMania 2, specifically in the Chicago portion of the show. And Hulk Hogan defended the world title against King Kong Bundy in a steel cage match in the LA portion of the show. But the fact that they had Bruno and Hogan as active participants at the same time, on the same card, at a WrestleMania, it makes me wonder, man, what would have happened if they did that face versus face match? Hulk Hogan versus Bruno Sammartino, the duel, the clash of the eras. Now, there were quite a few reasons that this wasn't going to happen. Even though Bruno was still in pretty damn good shape at this point. I think he was in his 50s at this point. He still looked pretty damn good. Vince was obviously, and many other promoters at the time, didn't like doing face versus face matches. And if you do Hogan versus Sammartino, who's the heel in that scenario? Those are guys that are just about as classic babyface as you could possibly be. And that's not something that Vince would have been interested in doing. And also, you got to wonder, where are you hosting the match? Because if they had done that match in New York, you're running the risk of a split crowd. At best, I think Bruno probably would have been cheered over Hogan, even though Hogan was red hot at the time. It was just the man. I think Bruno was such a god in New York, in that area of the country, that he would have gotten that reaction. If you hold the match in L.A., Hogan would have probably gotten cheered over San Martino, and would the LA fans have even known who Bruno is? I don't know. But I guess that's one of the things that makes the match kind of mysterious and intriguing to me. It's like, what would have happened if it actually took place? Again, it's one of those ones that would have been great for the history books, if nothing else. Now, a handful of the matches I talked about on this list were ones that were more of a cross-promotional appeal, like WWF versus WCW or WWF versus NWA or something like that. But this is a match between two purebred WWF WWE icons. Hulk Hogan, the man who ushered in the rock and wrestling era, the man who helped create WrestleMania, versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, the guy who, as I said earlier, personified the Attitude Era. He was the living, breathing representation of WWF Attitude. This match it's the two most iconic stars in WWE history, without question, in my eyes. When I think of WWE, WWF, whatever you want to call it, Hulk Hogan and Steve Austin are the two images, the two faces that instantly pop up in my mind. Because they just completely defined their eras and became larger than life icons. And I know I use the word icon a lot, but in the case of these two men, it absolutely applies. And it is baffling to me that this match never happened at a WrestleMania. Supposedly Austin turned down the match when it was originally pitched to him at WrestleMania 18, WrestleMania X8, whatever you want to call it. I also feel like they could have done the match a year later at WrestleMania 19. If they'd wanted to do that. Granted, I really enjoyed the match with Vince, and the match that Hogan had with Vince, and the match that Austin had with Rock. It was a fitting farewell for The Rock. But, again, I would say doing Hogan and Austin is worth more than Hogan Vince and another Rock Austin match combined. I think doing Hogan versus Austin, for the sake of the history books and the sake of being in front of that crowd, one of the best WrestleMania settings and crowds ever, I think it would have been a great place to have that match, and I would have thoroughly enjoyed it, most likely. And I'd even heard talks that there was plans to do Hogan versus Austin in Texas at WrestleMania 25, and that never materialized. And of course, if they had done it in Texas, Austin would have been the one cheered over Hogan, without a doubt. But again, it's just bizarre to me that they just couldn't get it together and get that match to take place. The closest we got was the opening segment to WrestleMania 30, where the two of them shared the stage with The Rock at the beginning of the show, where Hogan famously botched the name of the venue. But, man, it's fun to think about. It's like, God, what would have happened if we'd gotten that match? Who would have gone over in that case? I have absolutely no idea. Whereas when they did, I guess if they did the match at WrestleMania 18, it would have been Austin. If they'd done the match at 19 for Austin's farewell, probably would have been Hogan. Do the match at 25 in Texas, probably would have been Austin. But again, for the sake of the history books, I think that this is, for me, more so than Flair Hogan, this is one that they really missed out on. And I think it's one that it's a shame that we never got it.